The Trumpet Daily with Stephen Flurry.
Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to the Trumpet Daily radio show. We're off and running on another week of broadcasting here in the heart of winter on the beautiful, actually it's a beautiful sunshiny day here at Edstone, a little chilly outside, but a nice day as it usually is here. We've got one more day left in the calendar year, which means if Sam is doing his job, we'll have an exciting montage for you on tomorrow's program. We'll put a little extra pressure on him as he puts the finishing touches on that over the course of today. So you can look forward to some of the highlights or lowlights, I guess, depending on how you look at the news of the year. You can look forward to that on tomorrow's program. On today's program, for the second half, for that Bible study slot, we'll be playing the latest video that we produced here in the UK on God's family government. That'll be posted as a video on the website later on today. So that'll make up the second segment. And since it's pre-recorded, that'll give Sam and I a little extra time on the golf course this afternoon, so we can take advantage of this beautiful sun. If we ever did golf in the winter, we definitely would have to leave right after the program because there's not a lot of daylight when it's December and January. Richard forwarded some feedback, and we're getting it from a variety of platforms, I guess, Facebook, YouTube. Occasionally we get some emails as well. In fact, I got a letter, actually snail mail, came in today. This is someone that says, kindly note that I will be departing for Zambia on the 29th of January, so that sadly, once again, I will be unable to attend either of the meetings on February 1st and 2nd in Birmingham or the 22nd in Belfast. And then the individual requests a couple of pieces of literature. So that's always nice when, even if they can't come, they take the time to write out or type out, in this case, a letter to say that they won't be able to make it. So that serves as a reminder there that we've got the Birmingham Pack coming up on February 1st and 2nd. And then 3 weeks later, up in Belfast, Northern Ireland, once again, we'll look forward to meeting with you trumpet readers in both of those locations. Speaking of the trumpet, Richard on Facebook, he had this exchange with someone Friday after I had talked about the latest print edition of the Trumpet magazine. Someone wrote in and asked, how can I get a copy of that issue? And so we sent them a link to be able to subscribe and to read the material online. And then the response to that was, thank you. My grandmother introduced me to this about 30 years ago. I would go read her magazines, and we would discuss the most recent sermon she attended. She never missed one. I sure miss her. Can't wait to dig into these magazines again. So 30 years ago, I'm wondering if maybe that's the plain truth. That's, of course, right when the PCG started. In any event, that's an excited reader who is happy to get her own subscription. Another one here says, way back in 1983, when I accidentally discovered the magazine titled The United States and Britain in Prophecy, or booklet, I guess they mean, the pages were torn. I can read it. It says, I could read it only in partial, but I loved the message. It says, many years have come by before I was able to read it again. Indeed, I was privileged to read those magazines in advance before it hit the newspaper headlines. That's someone, again, very appreciative of the church literature, the trumpet, the plain truth before that. Regarding the trumpet, another one wrote, best magazine on planet Earth. It says, the Trumpet Daily, excellent mixture of today's world news with biblical prophecy to know what time we are living in. Thank you. This one in response to the program Sam did last week. I guess that was, Thursday? It says, well done, Sam. Your hard work and diligent study of the report proves beyond any doubt that a breach of policy has been committed by the higher echelon of the DOJ and other powerful agencies. Lies, lies, and more lies have been uncovered, all to undo the 2016 election, all to overthrow and impeach a duly elected president of the United States. It says, this same individual, more generally, it says, P.S. I truly love tuning in to the Trumpet Daily to hear about the corruption being uncovered, the 8 years of Mr. Obama's reign over America, and how he truly transformed this country into a surveillance state, as in Orwell's book 1984. The similarities are surreal. It says, thank God that he is pushing back against Satan's attack on America and Britain and Israel, even though just temporarily, but nonetheless, it's definitely a sight to truly behold. So a little bit of feedback from some of you listeners. We certainly appreciate that, and offer all of you an opportunity to send that in if you'd like to do it through the social media sites or to send an email. Of course, you can do that at td@kpcg.fm. Well, so many violent attacks. If you're watching the news on any given weekend, it seems there's no let up. There's no let up with the violence. There, over the weekend, there was a shooting at a church near Fort Worth. 2 people were killed in that violence. And then, of course, you probably read yesterday about the machete attack, or the individual wielding a machete on Jews, just celebrating Hanukkah in a house. This crazed attacker waltzes into the party, basically, and starts hacking away at Jews. The New York City governor, Andrew Cuomo, this is what he had to say about the attack. Clip 1.
This is violence spurred by hate. It is mass violence, and I consider this an act of domestic terrorism.
Mass violence, he says. He called it domestic terrorism. That's gotten a few headlines, but he's certainly spot on with the fact that we see this so often. Mass violence. There was a New York Post headline today. Mass killings in the U.S. hit record high in 2019. What about all of this violence? We'll focus in this first segment on violence aimed at Jews. But it's not just Jews, obviously. Mass killings, this Post article says more than 210 people died this year in 41 mass slayings, making 2019 the deadliest year in massacres since at least the 1970s. So much crime and violence. In a study recently, this was last week, I guess, we talked about the days of Noah. Genesis 6 covers that history, Genesis 6 and 7. And of course, Jesus Christ referred to it. He referred to the days of Noah, and he said it's going to be just like the days of Noah in the last days. Genesis 6:5, it says, God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Like I've pointed out to our students at the college, this was a society right before the flood that was pretty sophisticated. It wasn't, you think back thousands of years and just think, well, it must have been somewhat backward, primitive. It wasn't. It was advanced. Perhaps not as advanced as it is today as far as technology and all that is concerned. But still, this was a sophisticated society, a time of rapid advancement, and also accelerating evils, all kinds of wretchedness and perversion. And Jesus, of course, warned us. He said it's going to be just like the days of Noah. Yesterday on NBC, you had Chuck Todd. I just thought this was a fascinating insight into the way they think, the radical left, the anti-God radical left. He's quoting in this segment, this is on national TV, he's quoting from a letter that someone sent in to, I think, a newspaper in Kentucky or something like that. And of all the letters submitted to all the newspapers around the United States, This is the one that Chuck Todd saw fit to communicate to his viewers. This is clip 5.
I want to read you guys a letter to the editor that we found in the Lexington Herald-Leader. It was a fascinating attempt at trying to explain why some people support President Trump. Here's what he says. Why do good people support Trump? It's because people have been trained from childhood to believe in fairy tales. This set their minds up to accept things that make them feel good. The more fairy tales and lies he tells, the better they feel. Show me a person who believes in Noah's Ark, and I will show you a Trump voter. Look, this gets at something, Dean, that my executive producer likes to say is, hey, voters want to be lied to sometimes. They don't always love being told hard truths.
That's Chuck Todd yesterday saying that, if you're going to believe a fairy tale like Noah's Ark, well, you must be a Trump supporter. You must be that stupid. You must not even want to hear the truth. The way these individuals think, the way they dismiss the Bible, when here Jesus Christ confirmed the authenticity of that history. He referred to it. And so did so many of the New Testament writers, Peter, Jude. They pointed us back to that history. They pointed us back to Sodom and Gomorrah. They said, you better learn the lessons. You better learn from it. But these left-wing academics, they don't want to learn. They don't want to be told the truth. They don't want to be preached at. They don't want to hear about the Bible. This was, I don't know if it was the same segment, but in this next bit, here's Chuck Todd talking about what he sees as the conservative ecosystem and its evil roots. This is clip 6.
Matthew, I want you to address what I think is an ecosystem problem, at least on the right. I want to put up something that my colleague Ben Collins put here. It's a bit of an ecosystem here. He'll say, you'll get something starts on 4chan, there's the subreddit of Trump, InfoWars might pick it up, then it starts inching into the mainstream. Gateway Pundit might just say, oh, what's this about? Then it gets to Drudge, might have a provocative headline link. Rush might say it in his fun little way. Then it does make its way into Fox News. And then, of course, your Facebook feed. How do you create more accountability in the conservative ecosystem for basically dealing with propaganda?
Well, it's hard work.
It's hard work, he says, in response to Chuck Todd saying that Fox News, Rush Limbaugh, they're just spewing propaganda on a daily basis. And it traces its roots go back to these obscure websites, I guess, that no one's ever heard of. But the arrogance and the contempt that these people have for the Bible, for tradition, for our own history, the contempt that they have for God just practically oozes from their pores. The Apostle Paul said that they shall turn away their ears from the truth and shall be turned unto fables. They're going to turn away from the truth. They're the ones who believe lies. They're the ones spewing lies. What about NBC? What about MSNBC? What about CNN? What about Genesis 6? This history that Chuck Todd mocks. This history that many believe is a fairy tale. Jesus Christ didn't believe that. The Apostle Peter didn't believe that. Verse 12 of Genesis 6 says, and God looked upon the earth, and behold, it was corrupt. For all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. Everyone was corrupt. The problem is the human heart. Whether it's Chuck Todd or any other commentator for that matter. Do we see the evil within? The evil that's generating all kinds of violence. All forms of violence. Grabbing a machete and then waltzing into a house to kill some Jews. It happens in New York. It's happening all over the world. Verse 13, and God said to Noah, the end of all flesh is come before me, for the earth is filled with violence. It's filled with it. And so God had to destroy human civilization, except for Noah's family. Why? Because it was full. The earth was full of violence. And so what did Jesus say in Luke 17? He said, and as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it also be in the days of the Son of Man. In other words, the days leading up to the return of Jesus Christ to this earth. Yes, indeed, Christ is coming back to this earth. That's no fairy tale. Jesus certainly didn't believe Noah's Ark was a fairy tale. He expects us to learn lessons from that history. We should have learned. They should have learned for centuries upon centuries after the flood. Noah, as I said last week, he was around for a few hundred years, even after the flood, this great patriarch. And you think everyone would have looked to him and knowing what had happened, you would think it just would have sobered them. You would think it'd motivate them to stay close to God. But like I said last week, I guess it was Friday's program, it was about a century or so. And then man started to embrace the way of violence and corruption. And when you look around and see all of these attacks aimed at Jews, what does it mean? Where is it leading? If you look at history, Richard Palmer brought this out in a feature at the Trumpet, September of this year, 2019. He covered quite a lot of history in this long article on anti-Semitism, and he brought out how that it's been a symptom of a society-wide crisis. It's like the canary in the coal mine. When you see it, and the other thing Richard brought out in his piece is that, you know, a lot of times you'll see spikes in anti-Semitism or violence aimed at Jews when there's something significant that happened in the Middle East or something that the left wing, generally speaking, although there's certainly acts of violence coming from the far right as well. But a lot of times, historically, it's been, a spike because of something that people are upset about. But now this is just normal now. In other words, there's no event. There's no news that's driving the increase. It's just on the up and up. These violent attacks against Jews. And it's all over the world. It's not just a European thing. As we're seeing over the weekend, it's in the United States. It's here in the UK. As the Telegraph brought out this morning, from North London to New York, a frightening new wave of anti-Semitism has dragged us back in time. We're going backward. Even when we've got all of this modern advancement, even when we're such a sophisticated and interconnected society. Look at the direction, morally. You have people on the air just breathing contempt for the Bible and the history in the Bible. Nothing but fairy tales. And here, look at our world and consider what Jesus said. From North London to New York, a frightening new wave. You had the attack in New Jersey just a few weeks ago. 6 dead there. A Jewish market. We've got to find some Jews to kill. We've got to find some Jews to cut up. This Telegraph piece says, my London-born father was alert to anti-Semitic slurs, but I, born after the war, assumed that Hitler's Holocaust had made Jew hatred forever inadmissible. That assumption held true until about 5 years ago when anti-Semitic tropes made an unexpected return to the political discourse for a nationalist right and the anti-Zionist left. Now it's making its way into politics. We see that here in the UK with the Labour Party. This is not some fringe group that gets 2 or 3 people to vote for it. Look at the AfD in Germany. It's rising in popularity. The New York Post had an article over the weekend about attackers being set free. Just a little slap on the wrist. It says suspects arrested in last week's spree of 8 anti-Semitic attacks. This is separate and apart from the machete attack. But the suspects arrested in last week's spree of 8 anti-Semitic attacks are being quickly released right back into the neighborhoods they terrorized thanks to bail reform legislation, which doesn't even take effect until January 1st. These judges, they just can't wait to let people out of jail. What'd you do? Oh, well, I attacked some Jews. Okay. You're off and running again. We'll see you later. The Federalist had a piece here about how that we can't ignore this anymore. This problem. It brings out the attack at the Jewish grocery store in Jersey City. And then the violence, the hatred. As far as New York City is concerned, the hatred between blacks and Jews. This piece is saying we've got to address it. We've got to address this. It says here, it has frankly been astounding how little attention attacks on Jews in New York City area have received. If any other minority group were subject to such abuse, it would be a leading national story. Why have these attacks been swept under the carpet? The clearest answer seems to be that the news media and our political leadership are uncomfortable with the fact that many of these attacks, including last night's, were perpetrated by black people. They're just uncomfortable with that, so they don't cover it. It says, make no mistake, if white supremacists in MAGA hats were shooting minorities or carving them up with machetes, it wouldn't just be news. It would be the only news. That's all that they would cover. We have an example from, I'm sure you'll get a bit of it in the montage tomorrow. Jussie Smollett. Fake news. A fake attack. And that was headlines for days, for weeks. Here in the UK, if you have a black footballer that says he heard a racial slur in the stand somewhere, they will search far and wide to track down the perpetrator. And that'll be in the news for days. But this kind of violence, well, it's just swept under the rug. It's kind of uncomfortable. We can't really get into it. So let's just downplay it. It says here, so satisfying would that narrative be to our politicians and scribes, the MAGA hat violence that is. So satisfying would that narrative be to our politicians and scribes that we would scarcely be able to turn away. But alas, it's Jews being killed and maimed, and the criminals don't fit the bill of right-wing Trump-supporting Nazis. So, it's complicated. This author, by the way, is pretty critical of the New York City mayor that really just pays lip service to this problem, this division between the black community and the Jewish community in New York City. Listen to what Mayor de Blasio said on Fox News yesterday, clip 2.
I also want us to be clear what's happening here. An atmosphere of hate has been developing in this country over the last few years. A lot of it is emanating from Washington, and it's having an effect on all of us.
Wait, so you're saying you're blaming the president by saying it's coming from Washington?
I'm saying, but we have to be clear. We need a different tone starting in Washington.
Well, that's Ed Henry, at least confronting him when he says Washington. Oh, so this is about President Trump like everything? And he did back away from it, thankfully. But here, President Trump has done more for Israel probably than any modern U.S. president. And he's got family members, direct related family members who are Jewish. But we've got to take if there's any violence, surely it has to be President Trump's fault. this Federalist piece that says attacks on ultra-Orthodox Jews in Brooklyn have become an almost weekly occurrence under de Blasio. It says synagogues and schools are vandalized regularly, and children and old people are attacked. This is a crisis and has all too often happened throughout Jewish history. It has typically been ignored at best. At worst, the victims are blamed for not fitting in. It's easy to blame the Jews. Well, you're different. Well, you're money hungry. Well, you do this. You have these dietary habits. Whatever it is, there is a source behind it all. And we'll come to that in just a bit. I see I'm about out of time. Maybe we can save it for tomorrow, the video. In any event, let me just finish this Federalist piece. It says, nobody wants to talk about it, but something is going on between the black and Jewish communities in the New York City area, something that must be addressed. It says, the Jersey City shooters were black Hebrew Israelites. The machete-wielding man who attacked last night was also identified as black. It's time we stop simply wishing that this problem did not exist and address it full on. Well, but is it going to happen? Are they going to make progress? It's a problem that's spreading, and Richard brings that out well in the article from September. This author is saying, I can understand my father, his generation, knowing that this was a problem. But surely after the Holocaust, surely that's over. Surely that's not going to happen again. It says nobody wants to talk about this, but that's just too bad. It has to be talked about before more Jews are killed. It says there's no bigger story than this in the 5 boroughs and its adjacent communities. The war on Jews has to be ended, but before it can end, it must first be acknowledged. The war on Jews. What is the source? What is the cause of this? We'll look at that coming back after the break. You're listening to Stephen Flurry, and this is the Trumpet Daily Radio Show. If you'd like to email the program, you can send comments to td@kpcg.fm. We'll be right back.
This is KPCG-FM, and this is the Trumpet Daily. The Armstrong College Bible Correspondence Course is a distance learning program that makes the Bible clear and understandable. The correspondence course enables enrollees to learn what the Bible itself says about subjects that affect you and the world you live in. This fascinating Bible course highlights and proves what the Bible says about morality, war, religion, terrorism, and other current events, focusing on the root causes of this world's many problems facing man, as well as their solutions. The Bible and this course also focuses on the reason mankind was created in the first place, the way to happiness, accomplishment, and fulfillment, as well as the truth behind important doctrinal questions, such as what happens after we die, the nature of God, the resurrection, the millennium, and other critical subjects. Enroll today in the Herbert W. Armstrong Bible Correspondence Course. Email your request to td@kpcg.fm or visit thetrumpet.com. From the Philadelphia Church of God campus in Edstone, England, this is the Trumpet Daily Program with Stephen Flurry.
We will maybe tomorrow play the video on God's family government. In a lot of ways, that's the solution to this problem we're talking about today, the war against Jews. Anti-Semitism, the spread of anti-Semitism. What's the cause? Well, before I get to that, this piece at The Atlantic, this is more from the left wing, but it says the Jews are going underground. They're having to conceal their identity or their religion. It says, in a month of terrible anti-Semitic attacks, including a stabbing yesterday of multiple people at a Hanukkah celebration at a rabbi's home in New York, the news that most depressed me did not involve violence. It was not something done to Jews, but something Jews did. What's the problem here? It says a synagogue in the Netherlands is no longer publicly posting the times of prayer services. If you want to join a service, you have to know someone who's a member of the community. This is what's most discouraging to this author. The fact that Jewish synagogues in Europe, at least in this particular case, they can't publicly post the time for their services for fear of coming under attack. They have to conceal that information. They have to worship secretively. That's what it amounts to. It says in Europe and the United States, Jews have been repeatedly assaulted on the street. Tombstones were desecrated in Slovakia. In London, anti-Semitic graffiti was painted on synagogues and Jewish-owned stores. A Belgian daily newspaper accused a lawmaker who is Jewish of being a spy for Israel. A Polish town refused to install small brass plates that commemorate Holocaust victims. In Italy, this one town, the mayor said that having these commemorative plates or whatever, it would cause division. We don't want to cause division, showing support for Jews. So let's just not do it. It says this intolerance is coming from right-wing extremists, progressive leftists, and other minorities who themselves are often the object of persecution. It says anti-Semitism, anti-Semites seem to think that it's open season on Jews, and maybe giving the many incidents, they're right. Why the increase? What's driving this? This disturbing trend that just keeps getting worse. It says, so why has the news that a synagogue in the Netherlands stopped posting the time of services upset me above all? Because it's vivid proof that anti-Semitism is driving Jews underground in the West. In the West. In our prosperous nations. In our sophisticated society. All of this modern advancement. Consider the examples. This is in the Atlantic. For some time now, many kippah-wearing Jews have adopted the habit of wearing baseball caps when visiting Europe. They have to hide the kippah. Young people think twice before wearing Israeli flag t-shirts when they wander the streets of Paris, or before carrying a backpack with the name of their Jewish youth group prominently displayed. It says further on, during a trip to Berlin, a friend gave me directions to an out-of-the-way synagogue. After some intricate explanations, he added that if I got lost, I should look for police on the street with submachine guns. That, he said, would be the entrance to the synagogue. If you find a building with police and submachine guns out front, that's probably the synagogue. He said if he got lost, to just look for older men wearing baseball caps to cover up their kippahs. They're probably Jews on the way to the synagogue. This is 2019, almost 2020. The war against Jews. The Atlantic says Jews have been living defensively for a long time, but when a synagogue, as a precaution, decides not to post the time of services, we have reached a new level. It says in Spain in the 15th century, many Jews sought safety from persecution by converting to Christianity, but secretly maintained their Jewish practices. That's where it's headed. We're already getting there. Jews having to conceal their identity all across Europe. They certainly don't want to proudly display it. What does this mean? What have we seen in history when there's been a rise in anti-Semitism? What has it led to? like Richard brings out in that September article, it's really a symptom of a society-wide crisis. It says something about our world. It says something about our nations. It says something when synagogues in Europe use about a fourth of their budget on security. They've got to pay for men that have submachine guns to protect them out front. And it's even working its way, as I said earlier, into political movements. Large, popular political parties. Hatred of Jews. My father in a program back in 2015 on Adolf Hitler, how that he was Satan-inspired, Satan-possessed, in fact. He talked about some of the history, what has happened throughout history. This is clip 4.
It's the same act again and again. It happens throughout history, and yet man still doesn't understand it and doesn't understand why we get caught up in all of this violence. We don't know the source of it. We don't know what's really happening, like in the Middle East today. But we should know. We ought to know.
We ought to know the cause. We ought to know why. One of the things that Richard did in that September article is he just tried to bring everything together that my father's written or said about anti-Semitism. There's an excellent section, by the way, in Chapter 8 of the Key of David booklet. Why anti-Semitism? Why do we see it? Why is it on the rise? Richard writes in his piece, as anti-Semitism rises, memories are fading of what has happened historically when Jew hatred has surged. And then he gives some dreadful statistics, some shameful statistics about our ignorance of history, even recent history. Why the trend? He says elsewhere in the piece, in France, anti-Semitic acts were up 74% in 2018 compared to 2017. In the U.S., they doubled. In Germany, they rose 20%, with violent attacks up 60%. The U.K. has set new records for the largest number of anti-Semitic incidents in each of the last 3 years. There's no world event that's driving this upward trend. It's just happening. It's just the new normal. And it's happened historically. And it's culminated in a worldwide crisis as recently as the 1940s. Just 80 years ago. 75, 80 years ago, that's it. And yet many of our young people, they're totally unaware of this history. Here's the source, John 8, verse 44. It says, "You are of your father the devil, and the lusts of your father you will do. He was a murderer from the beginning." This was Jesus Christ speaking to the religious people of his day, saying, you're part of the problem. They don't want to accept the message that Jesus Christ proclaimed. And it's the same today. Don't talk to me about Genesis 6. Don't talk to me about fairy tales. Even as they go about rejecting God's truth and embracing fables. You are of your father the devil, and the lusts of your father you will do. He was a murderer from the beginning, and he abode not in the truth, because there's no truth in him. When he speaks a lie, he speaks of his own, for he is a liar and the father of it. He's the father of lies. He's the father of hatred. He's the father of violence. We need to hear more about this God, the God of this world, because he's the cause. And listen, that Key of David booklet, chapter 8, it talks about how the devil really does have a special hatred for the Jews, an intense hatred and rage aimed at the Jewish people. Why? Well, this is from the Key of David booklet. It says, Satan can stir up vicious hatred. Vicious hatred. He loves to use out-of-control emotions. A religion taken to the extreme, such as radical Islam, gives him a great field to work in. Nazi Germany exhibited fanatical hatred for the Jews. The Nazis also used emotion to stir up a repugnant hatred. The coming beast power, that's talking now about prophecy. The coming beast power will exhibit the same hatred for Jews as well. Most people who hate the Jews don't even know why they do. Can we see Satan behind such lies and hatred? They don't even know why. They don't even know why the animosity is there, why the hatred is there. Satan has reserved a special hatred for the Jewish people because he understands God's plan and purpose. He knows what Jesus said in John 4, that salvation is of the Jews. My father has brought out before, and it's in the Key of David booklet, even the way God has used the Jewish people to preserve the oracles of God, as it says in Romans chapter 3. Romans 3, verses 1 through 3, I believe it is. God used them to preserve Scripture, to preserve the sacred calendar. It's not that they're a special people in any, sense that we're all special. We're all made in the image of God. But God does work through people. God works through His church. And God has worked through the Jewish people, the tribe of Judah. You can see what He says there in Genesis 49. The scepter people. You can see what He says in John 4 and verse 22. And of course, as my father brings out in the booklet, spiritually, we all are Jews if we're converted. We all must become spiritual Jews if we're to be born into God's family. So Satan hates this. He hates this truth. He hates God's plan of salvation. He hates that it opens up salvation to all of humanity, that it allows for them to become, spiritually speaking, Jews. And so he does anything and everything that he can to destroy, to lash out at this particular group of people. My father, in that Hitler program from 2015, he talked about Hitler's hatred for the Jewish people. And he also mentioned that example in Romans 3, where it says that God would use the Jews to preserve the oracles. This is clip 3.
Now let me read you an amazing statement here from our booklet on the Germany and prophecy. Hitler considered the Jew to be the devil personified. We wrote, in truth, the Jews have been specially commissioned to preserve the oracles of God. Romans 3, verses 1 through 3. The oracles include the sacred calendar, knowledge of the biblical week, including the seventh-day Sabbath, and the Old Testament scriptures. So, when you stop and think about that, now he thinks the Jews are the devil personified, and yet God has commissioned them to do something, not because they're favorite people, but because God wanted them to help bring humanity to God. And they and other nations of Israel have not done that job well at all. But look, if you understand this, that you can see that it's not the Jews that Hitler hated most of all. It was God and what God is doing. It was God's Word. And yet, that's exactly what Satan the devil hates and has tried to cast to the ground time and time again, and has succeeded just only as God would allow them. But look, there's just so many things that Hitler showed to us that we ought to know more about this history. I mean, this is recent history. It's not like it's ancient history. This was World War II.
That's my father in 2015, talking about the hatred that Satan has for the Jews. It's really a hatred for what God is doing. It's a hatred for the plan of salvation, the God family plan. In the Key of David booklet, it says Satan, the devil, understands the plan of God. He has a great hatred for God. Because of the plan of God, the word Jew can really stir up Satan's wrath. Hatred for Jews has been inspired by the devil. That's where it's coming from. John 8 and verse 44. That's the source. He's the father of the violence and the hatred. In fact, Satan hates anyone who's connected to God. Spiritual Jews, first and foremost. Look at how many spiritual Jews Satan has taken out. Look at how many spiritual lives he's destroyed. Talk about violence and hatred. People that once knew the truth of God and that have since departed from the truth or fallen away from the truth, and the things that you hear them say on occasion, the things that you hear them say or do, I'll see or hear interviews from time to time, former members of the Worldwide Church of God talking about their experiences in the church and the hatred for Mr. Armstrong, the hatred for God's truth. It's like what you heard in that NBC clip from yesterday. They went from believing the truth to accepting fables. Now the Bible's a fairy tale. Now there's no truth to the Bible. Well, now I'm an atheist. Now I don't believe any kind of religion. What a shame. That's some spiritual violence. God says we should have learned the lesson from Noah's day. He looked at this earth, God did, and saw the wickedness of man, that it was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. Yeah, but it couldn't have happened. There couldn't have been a flood. Or Sodom and Gomorrah, that's just a fairy tale. I mean, I know if you travel down around the Dead Sea, everything is just dead and barren. It's like it's been torched. I know it can maybe look like that happened, but it really didn't. It just happens to be a hot spot. It just happens to be really hot and desert-like. God says we need to learn the lessons of this history. He looked upon the earth, verse 12 of Genesis 6, and said, Behold, it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted his way upon the earth. This was just 10 generations from Adam to Noah. After the flood, it took about a century. And then we're introduced to Cush and Canaan and Nimrod. And we know what Nimrod did. Genesis 11 and verse 9, it says, Therefore is the name of it called Babel. We went through this on Friday. This is what they built. This is the post-flood world established by Nimrod, building all these cities, these city-states. They built the Tower of Babel because the Eternal did there confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Eternal scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. Here's another example of God confounding the languages, and then he scatters them about. So all over the world, you see all these different languages. I mean, it fits right with the Bible. But we're supposed to read this and conclude that it's just all a fairy tale. It's just all a fairy tale. You have customs and traditions practiced in all these different religions all over the world. And so many of them, with the customs and the traditions, like we've covered with this perverse mother-son relationship, they trace their roots right back to Babylon. This mystery, as it says in Revelation 17. It's no fairy tale. That beast, on her forehead is a name written, Mystery Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth. God wants us to not only know this history, but to remember and know and to learn the lessons from it. That's why Jesus said, as it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be also in the days of the Son of Man. That's Luke 17 and verse 26. Do you think Jesus believed in those Old Testament events? He went around telling everyone, search the scriptures. What scriptures was he talking about? Well, he was talking about the Old Testament. The New Testament hadn't even been written and preserved yet. Search the scriptures. Search the scriptures, know the scriptures, understand the scriptures, learn the lessons from the scriptures. That's what he preached. Teaching from the Bible. What is it? Luke. This is at the end of Luke. I don't have it in my notes here. If you just give me a second here. Verse 25 of Luke 24, it says, Then he said unto them, O fools, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Ought not Christ to have suffered these things and to enter into his glory? And beginning at Moses and all the prophets, he expounded unto them in all the scriptures the things concerning himself. This is Jesus. This is what he was preaching and teaching. He did a lot of it in and around synagogues. He spoke to Jews. He spoke to Gentiles. And in the end, he was the victim of a lot of violence. They hated him. They hated him so much they wanted to kill him. They wanted to murder him. Jesus said, verse 44, And he said unto them, These are the words which I spoke unto you while I was yet with you, that all things must be fulfilled, which were written in the law of Moses, and in the prophets, and in the Psalms, concerning me. Then opened he their understanding, that they might understand the Scriptures. And so all through the Gospels, he refers to Genesis 1, he refers to creation, he refers to the flood of Noah's day. He talks about Sodom and Gomorrah. And of course, we just read here, he refers to the law, the prophets, the writings, the Psalms. He preached out of the prophets. He told people who would listen, this is what the Bible has to say about me. This is what the Bible prophesied long ago about me, about my ministry, about God's coming kingdom. Search the Scriptures. Know the Scriptures. You better know them. They tell us everything that we need to know about God's purpose and plan. And we can make sense of these senseless acts of violence. We can understand the source. We can know the source for Jew hatred, for the war against Jews. We can understand why the Jews are going underground. It's because Satan the devil understands God's plan, and he has an intense hatred for that plan. And even the word Jew, as my father said, can just really stir up his wrath, his hatred, his animosity. Well, later this week, we hope we can play that other Bible study. I think that will be posted today, though, so today or tomorrow, so you can get the video on your own time. But I do want to draw attention to that, even though I've touched on that subject a few weeks ago, God's family government, because that's, as I said earlier, that's the solution to so many of these problems that we see intensifying in the world today. So many violent acts, so many mass shootings, so many senseless acts of violence. Why is it happening? Why is it worsening? Well, go back to that article by Richard, the September issue of the Trumpet, and then I also mentioned Chapter 8 of the Key of David booklet as well. You're listening to Stephen Flurry, and this is the Trumpet Daily Radio Show. If you'd like to email the program, send comments to td@kpcg.fm. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you tomorrow.